What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Three and Out YouTube page. I'm John Middlekauff, and we are talking football all day, every day. Make sure you subscribe, like the video, share it with your friends. Let's roll, baby. Okay, let's dive into the book. Legendary Bowl, Deciding College Football's GOAT. This book is scheduled to come out on June 10th, correct?
That's right. At 8 p.m., it'll be live on Amazon, both, the Kindle e-reader version as well as paperback and hardcovers.
Talk to me about how it originated, and then just describe to everybody kind of what you did to carry out this simulation, how you went about it.
So I grew up in a household, whether it was my mother or my father, we were always super passionate about sports. And from a very early age, it was always framing things in a historical perspective. How good is Jordan compared to this player? How good is this team compared to a team that played 15 or 20 years ago? Almost every conversation at the championship level broke down into some kind of GOAT debate, and not
Your
in
house,
that
your house was like First Take in
it,
Philadelphia.
it was basically like First Take, but you had to come with receipts. It wasn't gut feelings, and my father had no problem burying a 9-year-old Michael Calabrese who was not prepared for some follow-up questions. So that's kind of where it started. And then we put into the mix the NCAA football video game series, which I played all the way back to College Football USA 95, every single year playing it. And pretty quickly in the PlayStation era, you could edit the rosters. And when the last game came out and it got sunset and it was clear this is going to be the last game in the series for the foreseeable future, I started to tinker and to build rosters for who is the best Michigan team or Tennessee or USC or Georgia. And I just started doing it as a hobby. And then pretty quickly, I had 20 teams, I had 30 teams, I had 40. Well, now I can play a hypothetical playoff. I can simulate it, see what would happen. And really the big moment for me was when COVID hit and they shut down sports that week. I put out a tweet and I was like, I'm going to put together a tournament of the best teams. I made, these rudimentary graphic design cards recapping what happened, and it exploded. And from there, I was like, okay, I'm on to something. People are clearly interested. People want to argue about the teams that I picked, the bracket, what would happen in these hypothetical matchups. So I wanted to blow that out into the biggest form that I could, which in this case is a book. It's close to 300 pages. I do deep dives on every single team that go all the way back to 1980. And then at the end of the day, I had 68 teams, and it's a format everyone's familiar with. You got play-in games, you have 4 regions, goes down to the Final Four, the championship. And just from a pure college football nerd perspective, it was really exciting. Once I had everything in place, all of the roster editing, it took between 5 and 10 hours for every team. Because not only did I need to dig up rosters and look at combine stats and weights and heights and attributes and awards and everything else, I went through, in a lot of these cases, I wasn't born yet. So I went through and I watched 7 of Boston College's games from 1984 with Doug Flutie. It wasn't just flipping on his Hail Mary against Miami. I want to see what kind of offense they're running, what kind of defense, how aggressive they are with their play calling, because you could fine tune everything in the game. So once I had that ready, then it was just kind of a joy to watch it go through and just take notes and make sure to transcribe those notes into the book. So it feels like you're reading a real recap as though you would on ESPN.com or in the newspaper, wherever you get your news. I wanted to give it that feel. So you get to go through this journey for about 200 pages of game recaps. And it's interesting too, just teasing it out on social media. It's not just about being a champion, being the best. A lot of these teams held a special nostalgic place in fans' hearts. You had 2007 Hawaii. You had 1991 East Carolina with Jeff Blake. There's all these teams that
Sure.
all of a sudden they're alumni from that era.
Boise State 2010. I saw that. That's a sneaky.
Exactly. There's so many teams that were culturally significant to the sport that weren't champions. And that's really what I love about college football. It's not just who won the Super Bowl and then there's everybody else. There's 31 losers and one champion. There's room in college football for people to feel like a success story, whether it's an individual player winning the Heisman, winning a bowl game, having an iconic comeback. And I wanted to represent as many of those stories as I could in this field.
Well, what's funny is when I worked at Fresno State in '08 and '09 for Coach Hill, you just had such a reverence for the Boise State program. And I think a lot of people had looked down and made fun of because RIP Cole Brennan, that Hawaii team got just manhandled by Georgia. And I remember seeing that Boise team for a couple years. And by 2010, they had basically 3 years of all those guys. It's like, this team is as good as I thought they could have won a national championship. And obviously Kaepernick and the missed field goals in that game. But to me, I would imagine that's got to be the best non-power five team of the last 20 or 30, 45 years or whatever. They were on a different level, in my opinion, than that Hawaii team. Because I vividly remember watching that Hawaii game in college. I mean, the left tackle couldn't even touch the guy. It wasn't even fair. Where the Boise team, I think they had 12 or 13 guys drafted and several guys in the second and third round in the trenches. Uh, I thought they could have won a national championship. And Kaepernick and that running attack was a pretty tough team to play. It was freezing cold in that game. It was a big time upset. But I do think that Boise team has a special place in my heart because I truly believe they're one of the best teams that because forever they kind of got screwed in the sense that remember with the games they would always put them against another non-power five team. They played TCU. It felt like every year in a bowl game. It's like let them play USC or let them play a real team. But that specific team was as good as it gets.
Yeah, that team, I mean, you mentioned Kellen Moore. He won 50 games. He went 50-3 as a starter. He's going to be a soon to be college football Hall of Famer. Doug Martin, the muscle hamster, all-time nickname, but also just an absolute beast at running back. Titus Young and Pettis at wide receiver. They had it all. And as you mentioned, usually when I would go through these teams, a lot of them were half teams. They had some glaring weakness or deficiency. Boise was absolutely loaded top to bottom, and their coaching staff did a phenomenal job. They handled pressure. They kicked off that season against Virginia Tech, and they needed a 2-minute drill to go down and win the game. And it was like watching a professional team. It was like watching
Yeah.
Aaron Rodgers go down the field. You just felt this. It was a foregone conclusion that they were going to win. That's how good that they were. And we talked about it at the top with USC. You want to strike fear into other teams. They were one of the very few group of five teams I can ever remember that even when they played the big boys, it's like you better have everything buckled up tight because you need to play a perfect game to beat those Broncos. And that's why it was, a no-brainer to put them in the field. But what's interesting is with teams like Boise that are such a proud program, I had to, basically go through, is it the '06 team that upset Oklahoma in the Fiesta Bowl? Is it the 2010 team that did lose, but they got a higher AP rating at one point in the season? So there's lots of considerations. And that was also difficult with some power programs like Florida. Is it the Tebow team? Is it the Steve Spurrier '96 team? There's lots of different arguments you could make. But I think that's what makes it fun. And that's what I'm hoping that fans can debate on social and really get into it because there's lots of different things beyond just the wins and losses that make a team special or as highly rated as you could argue that they are.
One thing that jumps out to me is, your number one seeds, Nick Saban didn't have a team that made it. And I think many people you had the one team from his era would be the 19 LSU team, which is the number one seed. And it's not like one specific team for Saban jumps out because they really changed dramatically about the midway point, right? Physical defense, run game to be much more power offense. But they always had a lot of guys that get drafted on defense. My question is with the LSU thing or team, would they be good enough on defense? Patrick Queen was their linebacker, right? And Stingley, who was actually his one good year in college, was that year, and he's awesome in the NFL now. So it's not like they didn't have players, but you just look around and you go, are they good enough on offensively? I mean, they got $1 billion worth of player.
Yeah, it's interesting that LSU team because the way that you framed it defensively is correct. Patrick Queen and their secondary was elite. They had the Jim Thorpe Award winner. They had Stingley, who was the first true freshman All-American since Adrian Peterson. They just had a ton of talent on the back end of the defense, but you could run on them. Even Ole Miss in that season ran for, I want to say, 300 plus yards. John Rice Plumlee went berserk on them. So if they were to draw a team in the tournament that runs read option, that is run focused, a shootout definitely can unfold. And also you look at that season, we in retrospect view them as this unbeatable juggernaut. They almost lost to Texas. That game was, back and forth down to the wire. They end up hitting a long pass at the end of the game that goes for a touchdown to win by 10, or really it was more so if that's a first down and he gets tackled, they win by 3 in another shootout. So even the very top teams, and I can play this game with every single team in the book, 2001 Miami, they were this close to losing on the road to an 8-4 Boston College team. And they're arguably, people love to get into it with all of the pro talent that they had on that team, they're viewed as invincible. Well, they really needed to pull a rabbit out of their hat just to beat a team that only won 8 games. So that's what's interesting about college football to me. Even the most dominant teams historically, they still got a few breaks, and they're still, if you play a perfect game against them, and that's what's fun about the tournament, almost every team that you play, even if you're a one seed, they're all special in some way, shape, or form. So you're going to have to play your best football and get lucky to make it all the way and win 6 games.
When you go back and watch the 80, I was born in 84, so I don't really remember 80s college football, but you have the Nebraska team in the mid 90s as one of the one seeds, and I remember them. I mean, obviously, Tommy Frazier and Lawrence Phillips. No one really plays at the highest level college football like that. Uh, do you think like going back and what would that even work? How would it, obviously the other team wouldn't be prepared and they have NFL players running that. So they always say playing Navy or Army is difficult, right? Because you're not used to it. So you put an NFL running back who, let's face it, I mean, Lawrence Phillips is like a first round level guy. He's got a lot of problems, but I think he passed away too, RIP. And Tommy just had the issues with the blood clots. But how do you think that would have translated? Because like BYU looking in the 84, like they were a team that played much more like these modern day football, right? They passed the ball. Steve Young, the quarterback in 84.
It was Robbie Bosco
Yeah.
in
So they,
84.
they they had that stretch of all the really good quarterbacks, Steve Young, Jim McMahon. I mean, they were playing. It's why Andy Reid loves to pass because he went to BYU in the early 80s when everyone's running triple option and they're going four wide, slinging it around. And they were really an outlier that way. They were like Mike Leach 20 years ago, but in the early 80s relative to the rest of college football. So, and like you said, that's what's cool about this is all these teams, whether they won the national championship, whether they didn't, that they have a really, really significant role in the way that we talk about and think about and their fan bases. But not even just if you're an Auburn fan, that Cam Newton team, if you're an SEC fan, that was a huge, huge moment for the conference.
Basically, going back to the Nebraska comp, I would say having watched every one of their games, their fan base did a great job of uploading everything on YouTube. Number one, I believe it was their second game or first game of the season. They played Michigan State with Coach Saban. And Saban said after the game, Lawrence Phillips is the greatest running back I've ever coached against. And he was including the NFL at that time. That's the level of he had that dog in him. Like the guy, when he got to the second level, he was looking for people to run over. And to your point, you can compete running the triple
Did
option.
he have a big game against Michigan State?
They ran roughshod. I think they won 50-10 in that game.
Jesus.
Every single game that they played in that season, they went on a 27 point or more run. So when you think about Nebraska and you think about the triple option, you're thinking about, ball control and, shrinking the game down. No, they were hitting big plays left and right. And Frazier was the perfect athlete to run it. It was like putting your best athlete on your entire team at quarterback. And he never made a mistake with the football in the passing game, pitching it, pulling it, everything else. So I think they would absolutely cause problems. And what's interesting is modern college football defenses, we'll call it 2010 to 2024, they're all built on speed to a certain degree. And a lot of their defensive linemen weren't as, big as and imposing as some of the teams in 80s and 90s, where you look at the Nebraska offensive line, every guy's over 300 pounds. They were incredibly well disciplined. They had, I think, 2 or 3 holding penalties the entire season, which is ridiculous. So I think they were tacticians and they would have been able to move the football. But I agree with you. There were some teams that when I went back and looked, BYU looked like a modern offense. Boston College with Doug Flutie in 84 looked like a modern offense. They wanted him to throw it 40 times. They wanted him to run around and extend plays and make things happen outside, throw off platform, all those kind of elements. And then there was other teams that did feel a bit dated. 99 Wisconsin is in the book with Ron Dane. They had an absolutely elite defense. They wanted to shrink the game down. They wanted to run between the tackles, and they had multiple NFL linemen to do it. So, yes, that looks like a team that maybe could find themselves in deep water if they ended up later in the tournament facing an LSU or a high-powered offense. But a lot of these teams are not as ancient as they're made out to be in this argument that, oh, the athleticism is so different. That was what was fun for me in the research element, going through finding these Easter eggs. The 1982 SMU team, the Pony Express team, they had an Olympic shot putter on their defensive line. Not only was he an all-pro in the NFL, he won a silver in LA at the Olympics. So these athletes were really great. Maybe they weren't as deep as some of these modern SEC teams, but just 11 on 11 offense and defense, I think they absolutely could hang.
And that SMU team was doing NIL 40 years before NIL, paying those two running
They
backs.
sure were, yeah.
Well, one thing, I don't want you to, ruin the outcome of this, but could you tease? Because I see USC, number one seed, 04. They would potentially have to play the 2010 Stanford team. We know Harbaugh gives them trouble. And then in the third round, potentially the 23 Michigan team. I mean, that's a lot of Harbaugh. And we know Harbaugh in college gave Pete Carroll some issues. So I see a tough little road. If this was college basketball and you're looking ahead, there's no landmines here, but there are some landmines there for that USC team, specifically with Jim Harbaugh.
It's interesting. You can play that game with just about every one of the top seeds. Miami could draw Johnny Football in the round of 32. You think about, a potential quarterback who could handle the athleticism and breaking plays outside of the pocket. He's one of those guys. LSU in 2019, Jake the Snake, that Arizona State team. That was a team that, I was about 10 or 11 at the time when they made it
Yeah,
to the
same.
Rose Bowl. I always thought that they were pretty good. When I went back and watched, they were an elite, they were a generational team, and they are right up there with the great Pac 10 teams of all time. To be able to have an NFL quarterback like that, and then defensively, they had playmakers at all three levels of the defense. It gets really difficult for any of these teams to win. Yes, they would be a favorite. And what's interesting too, Colin Wilson of the Action Network, he helped me set some of the point spreads later in the tournament. You think to yourself, oh, it's 0-1 Miami, it's 2019 LSU. They're going to be 2 touchdown, 3 touchdown favorites over everybody. Not the case. All of a sudden, you get pretty close. They're a 5 point favorite. They're a 6 point favorite. And as we know in college football, any given Saturday, teams like that lose outright all the time. It can really come down to one or two plays, some turnovers. And that was what was interesting too, fine tuning the game to make sure that we had the right amount of chaos, the right amount of blocked field goals, missed field goals, all these different elements that go into a real football game, making sure that that was just right. Not necessarily to give the underdogs more of an advantage, but to make sure every team was well calibrated. I wanted to make sure that if the 95 Huskers were playing against a normal team from the 2000s, that they'd run right over them. And once I had that down, then all of a sudden the outcomes that were being spit out and the game flow and the narrative, it started to get really compelling. And I would say for any college football fan, it's kind of like a fun beach read. Father's Day is coming up. Like if you want to get that for somebody in your life, it's a perfect thing to kind of go into the nostalgia time machine and start to have these arguments in a little bit more of a concrete way. Because that's the only part of these GOAT arguments that I don't like. They usually end at an impasse in some way, shape, or form. I'm hoping to bust through that to a certain degree and say, okay, if Johnny Football is playing the Miami Hurricanes and Ed Reed and that defense, is he going to be harassed for 4 quarters? Let's find out what it actually looks like.
Who's the Miami '01 secondary beside Ed Reed?
So we got Mike Rumpf at corner, who was a first round NFL draft pick.
Yep.
Philip Buchanan, who was also a first round draft pick, who not only was phenomenal at corner, but he was also a huge game breaker in the punt return game. And then you had other guys in their secondary who were just filtering in
Sean
sub
Taylor.
packages. Sean Taylor came in. He played special teams. And also when they went three safeties, he was on the field. Antrell Roll as well. So the speed,
I like
athleticism, and
them versus Johnny Football. I'm not going to lie.
yeah, it's basically what's interesting about them is that offensively they kind of played within themselves. They could have pushed the tempo. If they went through an offensive facelift and they said we're going to play with a bit more tempo, we're going to open it up. They got Andre Johnson on the perimeter. They got Shockey at tight ends, and they had a backfield of Clinton Portis, Frank Gore, and Willis McGahee. They could have
Decent.
played fast, worn everybody out, and scored 50 points. But they didn't necessarily always want to do that. Sometimes they wanted to have those 9 and 10 play drives and then lean on their defense to win games. So that's what's interesting in terms of the argument on their side, which is if they get pulled into a higher scoring game, they can win that way. And if they want to win 17-13, they can also win that way. That's not necessarily true of all the teams. The LSU team you brought up as well. Some of these teams need the game flow to go just right to pull it out.
Might tell everyone where they can get your book.
So if you go over to Amazon, put in Legendary Bowl, it's going to populate. You're going to get your e-reader, Kindle version, paperback, as well as hardcover. And we were mentioning this before we hopped on. If I can get enough sales, my publisher already wants me to go with a Legendary Madness, which would be the exact same format, but for the college basketball teams dating back to 1980. I'd love to write it. It was a multi-year process to get this one done, but it was something that I look back on fondly. So I'd be happy to deliver it for fans.
Awesome, Mike. Well, I appreciate you coming on and look forward to seeing who wins the whole thing.
Thanks for having me.